The stage is set. The debate that will shake an entire generation is about to begin. When Sophia Carter takes the mic, she believes victory is hers until Barron Trump steps up. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. Watch till the end, comment your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. The stage is set, a clash of worlds. The grand auditorium of one of America's most prestigious universities was buzzing with anticipation. Hundreds of students had gathered, not just for another intellectual discussion, but for a battle, a verbal war that would shake the very foundations of their beliefs. The annual Great Debate Forum was notorious for its no-holds-barred approach. It was an arena where young minds tested their ideologies, clashed over policies, and more often than not, left with their perspectives altered. Professors watched in fascination. Students whispered in excitement. Some came for the thrill of seeing their champion obliterate the opposition. Others came for the sheer spectacle, because this event had made and destroyed reputations. But no one was prepared for what was about to unfold tonight. The evening had already seen fiery debates over economics, social justice, and international relations. But now the main event was beginning, the unfiltered open-floor session where anyone could step up, present an argument, and face challengers. And that's when she stepped up. A sharp silence swept through the room as Sophia Carter strode confidently toward the podium. She was a force of nature, known across campus as the most ruthless debater of her generation. A senior political science major with a mind as sharp as a blade, she had eviscerated every opponent she had faced in the past 3 years. No one debated against Sophia Carter and walked away unscathed. Her signature purple-dyed hair gleamed under the stage lights. Dressed in a sleek black blazer over a cropped band tee, she was the embodiment of modern rebellion. The smirk on her lips was one of absolute certainty. She didn't just believe she was right, she knew she was. Taking a deep breath, she leaned into the microphone, her voice cool and controlled, but with a sharp edge that sent a shiver down the spines of those in the audience. "We're here today to talk about progress." She paused, scanning the audience. Every eye was on her. But let's be honest, there's an elephant in the room. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Students exchanged glances. Sophia's lips curled into a knowing smile as she continued. "The truth is, our country is being held hostage by an outdated generation." The auditorium stirred. Some students leaned forward, nodding in agreement. Others frowned, already uncomfortable. But no one dared to interrupt her. While we struggle with the challenges of the 21st century, people over 50, people who can barely understand a smartphone, people who still think the Cold War is the biggest threat to America, are deciding our future. Their time is up. Scattered applause erupted. Some students clapped eagerly. Others whispered among themselves. Sophia knew exactly how to hold an audience in her grip, and she wasn't done yet. She pressed on, her voice growing bolder, more commanding. "Look around. We are the ones facing climate disasters. We are the ones burdened by an economy that they destroyed. And yet it's still their hands gripping the steering wheel, driving us straight into a future we never asked for." The applause grew louder. Some students even stood up, cheering. In the third row, a tall figure sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Few had noticed him before, but now a few whispered his name in surprise. Barron Trump. Unlike the others in the audience, he wasn't cheering. He wasn't shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He simply watched, silent, studying, waiting. Sophia's eyes flashed with triumph. The momentum was hers. She took a breath and delivered her most controversial statement yet. "What we need is an age limit on political participation." Gasps filled the room. A few students froze. Even some of her supporters exchanged uneasy glances. Sophia wasn't fazed. She doubled down. "Why should someone who won't even live to see the consequences of their choices have any say in our future?" The crowd erupted. More students stood, cheering wildly. Others remained deathly silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Sophia saw the mixed reaction and fed off it. She raised a hand, motioning for the crowd to calm down, then leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dripping with venom. "These people, these boomers, cling to their faith, their outdated family values. their Make America Great Again nonsense. She made mocking air quotes with her fingers. They're dinosaurs. Their America is dead, and it's time we buried it. The auditorium exploded. Some students were now on their feet, chanting in agreement. Others looked outright horrified. A few professors exchanged glances, clearly concerned about where this was heading. And in the third row, Barron Trump's jaw tightened. But he didn't react. Not yet. Sophia wasn't done. She gestured toward the audience, her voice booming with confidence. We need to start a movement to restrict voting rights in public office positions to those under 50. They had their chance. They failed. Now it's our turn. The crowd was now in chaos. Some students were screaming in agreement. Others were shouting objections. Professors tried to intervene, but the momentum was out of their hands. Sophia Carter stood at the podium, soaking in the energy. She had just dropped a bomb on the entire room, and she loved it. Dr. Wilson, the debate's moderator, stepped forward, his expression tense. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Does anyone wish to present a counter-argument? Anyone? He scanned the room. Students shifted uncomfortably. Some turned to look at one another, but no one moved. Sophia crossed her arms, smirking with satisfaction. No one? She said mockingly into the mic. Guess that means I win. Dr. Wilson glanced at his papers, about to move on to the next topic when a deep, clear voice cut through the noise. I would. The entire room fell silent. All heads snapped toward the third row. Barron Trump stood up. Sophia's smirk widened as she saw him approaching the podium. Well, she drawled, her voice dripping with amusement. Look who decided to grace us with his opinion. Daddy's boy himself. Scattered laughter rippled through the audience. Some students chuckled, already anticipating an easy takedown. But Barron's face remained unshaken. As he stepped up to the podium, his tall frame cast a long shadow over Sophia. He adjusted the microphone with calm precision, letting the tension hang in the air. And then, he smiled. Not a smirk, not arrogance. A genuine, almost sympathetic smile. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, and razor-sharp. Thank you for your passionate presentation, Sophia. But passion without wisdom is like a ship without a rudder. Powerful, but dangerous. The audience held its breath. Something had just shifted, and everyone knew. This debate was about to take a turn no one expected. The verbal war begins, a clash of ideologies. The auditorium was no longer just a debate hall. It had become an arena, and Barron Trump had just stepped into the ring. He stood tall at the podium, adjusting the microphone without a hint of hesitation. The room, which had been boiling with energy just moments ago, now hushed to a tense silence. Sophia Carter leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. She wasn't worried. Not yet. She had humiliated countless opponents before. What made Barron Trump any different? But then, he began speaking, and from the very first sentence, everyone knew this wasn't going to be like her previous debates. You speak of progress, Barron said, his voice even, deliberate, unshaken. But true progress isn't built by tearing down those who came before us. He let the words linger, his gaze sweeping across the audience. It's built on their shoulders. A murmur spread through the crowd. Students who had been nodding along with Sophia now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sophia's smirk didn't waver, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the podium. Barron continued, his voice now carrying a quiet intensity. You say people over 50 shouldn't have a say in our future. But tell me, Sophia, do you even realize who you're talking about? The auditorium stilled. You're talking about the very people who created the technology that allows you to research your arguments. The very people who built the economy that lets you sit here, debating instead of struggling to survive. The very people who fought for civil rights, for free speech, so you could stand here today and insult them. A wave of tension rippled through the room. Even some of Sophia's supporters hesitated, but she wasn't about to back down. She let out a mocking scoff, shaking her head. Oh, spare me the history lesson, Barron. We're not talking about the past. We're talking about the now. She leaned into the microphone, her tone turning sharp again. And right now, we're dealing with a broken system, run by people who refuse to adapt. Your so-called great generation, what have they given us? Climate disasters, a housing crisis, stagnant wages. She turned to the crowd, her arms wide open in a grand gesture. These so-called wise elders had their chance, and they failed. The room erupted again. Cheers, applause. Her supporters were reinvigorated. Sophia felt the energy shift back in her favor. She turned back to Barron, raising an eyebrow. So tell me, Mr. Legacy, how do you defend that? A lesser opponent would have faltered, but Barron didn't even blink. Instead, he smiled, not in arrogance, not in mockery, but in a way that said, "You just fell right into my trap." He leaned forward, his voice dipping into a low, steady cadence. "You think this generation has all the answers, don't you?" Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but Barron cut her off smoothly. "The same way every generation before us did." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Do you know what's fascinating, Sophia? Every single generation thinks they are the smartest, the most enlightened, the ones who will finally fix the world. And every single generation, without fail, realizes later how little they actually knew." The room was silent now, save for the occasional shifting of feet and a few murmurs. Barron's voice grew sharper, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. "You mock the past while standing on its foundation. You attack those who came before you, without acknowledging that the very freedom you wield was given to you by them." Sophia's jaw clenched slightly. She could feel it. The audience was starting to listen to him. She had to regain control. So she did what she always did when she was cornered. She attacked. "That's easy for you to say, Barron. You were born into wealth, into privilege. You stand here preaching about tradition, but you'll never understand what it's like to struggle." Her voice rose. "The system your father benefited from, the system that keeps you on top, is the same one that leaves millions behind." The crowd roared, some in agreement, some in outright shock. Sophia could feel the energy turning back in her favor. She pointed a sharp finger at Barron. "You talk about values, but let's talk about the real values of the past. Racism, sexism, homophobia, oppression. And you want us to honor that?" For the first time, the room felt unstable. Even Barron could sense it. The tide was shifting against him. Some students were shouting angrily now, booing, demanding answers. Sophia could feel her confidence returning. She turned back to Barron, expecting to see him falter. But then, Barron did something no one expected. He laughed, not a mocking laugh, not a nervous one. A quiet, almost bemused chuckle. Then in the midst of the noise, he simply shook his head and said, "It's interesting how quickly you abandon your own principles when they no longer serve you." Sophia's eyes narrowed. Barron met her gaze with piercing clarity. "You claim to fight for diversity, yet you reject diversity of thought. You preach inclusion, but only if people think exactly like you. And when you don't have an argument left, you attack the person instead of the idea." Sophia's confidence wavered for the first time. The room wasn't just watching anymore. They were thinking. And that's when Barron Trump went in for the kill. "You say we should throw away the past. But tell me, Sophia, what happens when someone comes along one day and says the same thing about you?" The words hung in the air like a hammer over glass. Sophia froze. The crowd fell into stunned silence. Even those who had been cheering her on looked unsure now, because for the first time, Sophia Carter had no response, and Barron Trump knew it. He stepped back from the podium, turning slightly. Then he delivered the final blow. "You fight so hard to tear things down, but maybe it's time you start thinking about what you're actually building." Then he walked back to his seat. The debate was not over, but something had changed, and everyone knew it. The ultimate showdown, chaos on the stage. The air in the auditorium crackled with tension. Sophia Carter stood frozen at the podium, her mind racing. She had faced tough opponents before, but none like this. None who had flipped the script on her so completely. None who had turned her own rhetoric against her with such brutal precision. Barron Trump had just dropped a philosophical bombshell, and the entire room was processing it in real time. Some students were whispering among themselves, clearly unsettled. Others still sat, arms crossed, defiant, but no longer cheering the way they had before. For the first time in her career as a debater, Sophia could feel her grip slipping, and that was unacceptable. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the podium. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Number. She wasn't going down like this. Not in front of this crowd, not in front of him. So she did what she had always done when cornered. She fought back, with everything she had. The comeback attempt. Sophia snatched the mic off the stand, stepping forward. She wouldn't play defense. She would go on the attack. "Oh, so that's your big argument, Barron?" she snapped. "That I'm not inclusive enough? That I don't respect diversity of thought?" She let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "That's rich coming from you. A kid born into unlimited privilege. A kid who has never had to fight for anything." Her voice rose. "Tell me, Barron, what do you actually know about struggle?" The room stirred. Sophia saw a flicker of emotion. The first real emotion from Barron. Good. She was getting to him. She pressed on. "You want to talk about building something? What have you built exactly? Other than a life of luxury off your father's name?" There it was. The low blow. The crowd roared. Some students cheered loudly, while others shifted uncomfortably. It was a cheap shot, and everyone knew it. But cheap shots work, or at least they usually did. This time, though, Barron didn't react the way she expected. Instead of anger, he looked at her with something unexpected, something that made her stomach twist. Pity. He slowly shook his head, exhaling sharply through his nose, as if she had just proven his point for him. Then he stepped forward again, and when he spoke, his voice was steady as steel. "You keep attacking me, Sophia. Not my argument. Me." The words cut through the noise like a blade. Sophia felt her chest tighten. She had walked straight into his trap, and she knew it. But Barron wasn't done. "You say I don't know struggle?" His voice dropped into something deeper, more personal. "Try living your life being judged not by your actions, but by your last name. Try walking into a room and knowing that no matter what you say, no matter how much you've worked, half the people have already decided who you are." The room fell deathly silent. Even Sophia couldn't hide the flicker of realization in her eyes. "You preach about fighting the system," Barron continued, "but what you're really doing is creating a new one. One where anyone who doesn't fit your vision of progress is dismissed." He shook his head. "You're not fighting for inclusion, Sophia. You're fighting for control." Boom! The words landed like an earthquake. Sophia felt her entire body tense. This was slipping away from her. She could feel it. The crowd wasn't just listening to Barron now. They were agreeing with him. She had to do something, anything, so she snapped. "The rain for sitting." Her voice cracked with frustration. "You're twisting my words." She jabbed a finger at him. "You want to talk about real struggle, Barron? Try growing up in a world that tells you who you can and can't be." Her breath was ragged now, but she pushed forward. "Try living in a system that tells you that you're not good enough because of where you come from, because of who you love, because of what you believe in." Barron didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head. Then, in a voice so calm it was almost chilling, he asked, "And your solution to that is to do the exact same thing to others?" Crack. It was over. Sophia's entire body stiffened. Her breathing was uneven. Her face was flushed deep red. She had nothing left, and everyone could see it. Barron hadn't just beaten her argument. He had exposed her hypocrisy, and he had done it without ever raising his voice. The collapse. Sophia opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in her life, she had no words. The silence in the room was deafening. Then someone in the back of the room started clapping. Slowly, then another, and then the entire auditorium erupted into applause. Not for Sophia, for Barron. He had won, and she knew it. Her hands gripped the podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. And then, something inside her cracked. Her shoulders slumped. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. Just the weight of her own words crushing her. She had lost. And for the first time, she understood why. Barron stepped back from the podium, his gaze softening ever so slightly. This was never about winning, Sophia. He glanced at the crowd. It was about seeing who was willing to listen. With that, he walked back to his seat, and Sophia Carter, campus debate champion, intellectual warrior, progressive icon, stood alone at the podium, utterly defeated. The great Sophia Carter had finally met a battle she couldn't win. And the worst part, it wasn't because she wasn't smart enough. It wasn't because she wasn't passionate enough. It was because, in the end, she had been fighting the wrong fight all along. Redemption and revelation. A new beginning. The thunderous applause echoed through the auditorium, shaking the very walls that had once housed Sophia Carter's unchallenged dominance. But tonight, everything had changed. She stood at the podium, frozen, her breath shallow and uneven. Her hands still gripped the edges of the wooden stand as if letting go would mean accepting defeat. And maybe that's exactly what it meant. The weight of Barron Trump's words pressed down on her chest like 1,000 bricks. She had stepped onto this stage so certain of her victory, so sure that she would crush any opposition. But now, she was the one left speechless. The crowd continued to applaud, but not for her. For him, for the one person she had underestimated the most. Her opponent, her enemy, her teacher, the fallen champion. For a moment, Sophia felt her vision blur. She had never lost like this before. Not just a debate, but her entire sense of certainty. She had spent years building her worldview, sharpening it like a blade, believing that she was on the right side of history, believing that she was the one who understood progress. And then, in the span of a single debate, Barron Trump had shattered it all. She could feel the students staring at her now, some waiting for her to lash out, others pitying her, and some, just like her, caught in the gravity of what had just happened. She was the one who had demanded change, but in the end, it was she who had been changed, and that terrified her. Sophia's throat was dry, but somehow she forced herself to move. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the microphone. And then, she spoke. The unexpected apology. I need to say something. Her voice was softer now, not the defiant, roaring, firebrand Sophia Carter that had stood here just an hour ago, but someone else entirely. Dr. Wilson, the debate moderator, had been on the verge of closing the session, his brow furrowed in concern as he studied her. "Are you sure, Ms. Carter?" Sophia swallowed. Her heart was hammering in her chest, but for the first time, she wasn't speaking to win. She was speaking to understand. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. She turned toward the audience. Some of them still expected her to lash out, but she didn't. She breathed in deeply, then said the words she never thought she would say. "I was wrong." A ripple of shock swept through the crowd. Even Barron, who had been sitting back in his chair, watching quietly, raised an eyebrow. "Earlier today," Sophia continued, her voice trembling, "I walked onto this stage so convinced that I was right, that I had all the answers, that anyone who disagreed with me was simply holding the world back." She let out a shaky breath. "I thought that fighting for progress meant eliminating everything that came before us, that we had to start fresh, that the only way forward was to erase the past." She turned toward Barron, meeting his gaze for the first time since the debate ended. "But you made me see something tonight that I didn't want to admit." Her voice tightened. "I've been fighting the wrong way." The audience was silent now, clinging to her every word. Even those who had cheered for her earlier were listening differently now, because this wasn't the Sophia Carter they had followed for years. This was someone who had just had her world shaken to its core, and she was finally brave enough to admit it. "I accused you of not understanding struggle," Sophia said, her voice thick with emotion. "But the truth is, I've never stopped long enough to understand anyone's struggle but my own." A few students in the audience shifted uncomfortably, because deep down, they knew they were guilty of the same thing. Sophia's fingers gripped the microphone tighter. "I disrespected those who came before us," she admitted. "And I didn't just attack their ideas, I attacked them as people. And that's not progress." She paused, her heart hammered. She looked down for a moment, as if collecting her thoughts. And then, when she looked back up, her eyes were clear. "That's just hate." A hushed murmur swept through the audience. Barron Trump remained completely still, watching, listening, waiting. And then, Sophia did something that truly no one expected. She turned fully toward Barron, and she extended her hand. The moment that changed everything, the auditorium held its breath. Would he take it? Would he shake the hand of the person who had spent the last hour attacking him? The person who had mocked his family, his values, his very existence? For a moment, Barron didn't move. And then, he stood up. He walked toward her, eyes never leaving hers. And then, he shook her hand. The moment hit like a tidal wave. Somewhere in the back, a single student started clapping. Then another, and another. And then, the entire auditorium erupted into applause. Not just for Barron, not just for Sophia, but for the moment itself, because they had just witnessed something real. Not a debate, not a performance, a transformation. Sophia Carter had stepped onto that stage believing she was there to change the world. But in the end, it was she who had been changed. Aftermath, a conversation in the shadows. That night, as students filed out of the auditorium, some still debating what had happened, some sitting in stunned silence, Sophia found herself lingering behind. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because, for the first time, she wasn't walking away from a debate as the winner. She was walking away as something else, something more. She turned and saw Barron gathering his things at the side of the stage. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to move. She approached hesitantly, stopping a few feet away. "Barron," he turned. To her surprise, he wasn't angry. Instead, he simply smiled. "Hey." Sophia shifted awkwardly, suddenly unsure of herself. She hesitated. Then finally she said, "I just wanted to say thank you." Barron studied her for a moment. Then he simply nodded. "You know what's interesting about being our age?" he said thoughtfully. "We're old enough to have strong convictions, but young enough to let them blind us." Sophia let out a soft laugh. "Yeah," she murmured. "I think I learned that the hard way." Barron grinned. "That's the only way we ever really learn." She smiled back. And with that, the debate was over. But the real conversation had just begun.